A racist passenger complains about sitting beside a black man, and the flight crew's response quickly goes viral. In the rarefied air of first-class cabin 3A, Alexander Thompson's carefully constructed world of privilege begins to crumble as his deeply rooted prejudices collide with the undeniable presence of James Carter, forcing him to confront the ugliest parts of himself in front of a plane full of smartphone-wielding witnesses. As the altitude rises and tensions mount at 35,000 feet, what started as silent bigotry erupts into a viral moment that will forever change both men's lives. But who will emerge stronger when the truth about power, privilege, and prejudice finally comes to light? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. The pristine corridor of first class gleamed under soft LED lighting as Alexander Thompson strode through Gate A23 at JFK International Airport. His polished Oxford shoes clicked against the jet bridge floor, matching the confident rhythm of a man accustomed to occupying spaces of privilege. At 52, Alexander wore his success like his tailored charcoal suit, impeccably and with an air of unquestionable authority. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," the flight attendant greeted him with practiced warmth. "Welcome aboard. C2A is on your right." Alexander nodded curtly, his mind already drifting to the quarterly reports he needed to review during the 6-hour flight to San Francisco. As he approached his seat, however, his carefully constructed world of expectations suddenly tilted on its axis. There, in Seat 2B, sat a black man who appeared to be in his mid-30s, wearing designer jeans and a casual gray t-shirt that, while clearly expensive, didn't align with Alexander's notion of first-class attire. The man was already settled in, AirPods in his ears, fingers moving efficiently across the keyboard of a MacBook Pro. Alexander's steps faltered almost imperceptibly. A muscle twitched in his jaw as he hoisted his carry-on into the overhead compartment. Years of conditioning kicked in. The country club memberships, the executive boardrooms, the luxury resorts. All spaces where he rarely encountered people who looked like his seatmate. "Excuse me," Alexander muttered, not quite making eye contact as he squeezed past to reach his window seat. The other passenger briefly glanced up, offering a professional nod before returning to his work. The simple acknowledgement somehow made Alexander more uncomfortable. As he settled in, Alexander found himself engaging in what he would never admit was a subtle dance of microaggressions. He pulled his expensive leather briefcase closer, though it was already securely at his feet. He angled his body slightly toward the window, creating an invisible barrier. When Sophie, the flight attendant, approached with pre-flight champagne, his eyes lingered expectantly, waiting to see if his seatmate would be offered the same service. "Would either of you gentlemen care for champagne?" Sophie asked with unwavering professionalism. "No, thank you," the man in 2B replied without looking up from his screen. "Just water when convenient." Alexander accepted his champagne, taking a longer sip than usual. His mind raced with assumptions he'd never speak aloud in polite company. How had this man ended up in first class? Perhaps a lucky upgrade? A mistaken booking? The possibility that his seatmate had simply purchased the ticket outright, just as Alexander had, seemed to exist in a blind spot of his worldview. The cabin gradually filled with other first-class passengers. Alexander noticed their subtle reactions, the slight double takes, the quick glances between 2B and the seat numbers on their tickets. He felt a sense of validation in their responses, as if each surprised look confirmed his own discomfort was justified. Through it all, the man in 2B remained focused on his work, his calm presence a stark contrast to Alexander's growing unease. The designer t-shirt that had initially struck Alexander as inappropriate now seemed to carry an air of confident self-assurance. The man wore it like he belonged exactly where he was, which somehow made Alexander even more agitated. As the final first-class passengers boarded, Alexander pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails he'd already read. His real attention, however, was on his peripheral vision, watching his seatmate's every move. Each tap on the keyboard, each subtle shift in position seemed to grate on Alexander's nerves. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure. As the cabin crew began their final checks, Alexander found himself trapped in an internal monologue that would have mortified his publicly progressive colleagues. Every justification for his discomfort, every assumption about his seatmate's presence, every rationalization for his own behavior, all of it rooted in prejudices he'd never acknowledge out loud. The man in 2B closed his laptop as the plane began to push back from the gate. In the reflection of the window, Alexander caught a glimpse of himself. His pinched expression, his rigid posture, his obvious discomfort. For a brief moment, he saw himself as others might see him, and something uncomfortable stirred in his consciousness. But like so many moments of potential self-reflection, he pushed it aside, choosing instead to focus on the familiar comfort of his prejudices. Little did Alexander know, as the aircraft turned toward the runway, that this flight would become more than just another business trip. In the hours ahead, his carefully constructed world of privilege and preconceptions would be challenged in ways he never expected, starting with the man quietly sitting beside him, James Carter, though Alexander hadn't bothered to learn his name. The engines roared to life, pushing them back into their seats as the plane began its takeoff roll. They ascended into the morning sky, leaving the ground behind, but carrying with them the weight of centuries of racial bias that was about to come to a head at 35,000 feet. At cruising altitude, Alexander Thompson's thoughts drifted back to his childhood in Greenwich, Connecticut. The pristine lawns of his family's estate, the gleaming halls of his private school, the immaculate fairways of the country club, all painted in shades of white privilege that had colored his worldview for half a century. He remembered his father's voice, smooth as aged scotch, explaining why they lived in certain neighborhoods and associated with certain people. The words were always careful, coded, wrapped in the language of property values and social standing. "It's not about color, son," his father would say, even though it was entirely about color. "It's about maintaining standards." The memory shifted to his mother's garden parties, where the only people of color wore uniforms and carried serving trays. He recalled how she would later praise their work ethic while simultaneously ensuring they remained invisible, part of the background machinery that kept their privileged world turning. A slight turbulence jolted Alexander back to the present. James Carter's fingers continued their steady dance across the keyboard, his screen filled with complex coding sequences that Alexander refused to acknowledge might indicate expertise. The soft tapping of keys seemed to grow louder in Alexander's mind, each click an affront to his sense of proper order. "Would you like to see the lunch menu, sir?" Sophie appeared beside them, offering leather-bound folders. James looked up, smiled, and accepted the menu with a thank you. His voice carried the polished accent of an Ivy League education, another detail that didn't fit into Alexander's predetermined narrative. "I'll have the salmon," Alexander said curtly, barely glancing at the menu, his jaw tightening as he noticed James studying the wine list with evident knowledge. A young white couple across the aisle caught Alexander's eye, offering knowing looks that mirrored his discomfort. Their silent solidarity only reinforced his beliefs. This was his world, their world being encroached upon. First class had always been a sanctuary, a space where the social hierarchy remained unchallenged. Until now. His mind wandered to his first-class upgrade 25 years ago. The sense of arrival, of belonging to an exclusive club. He remembered looking around the cabin then, seeing faces that matched his own, feeling the comfortable warmth of homogeneity. Now, watching James sip sparkling water while reviewing what appeared to be technical documents, that comfort had been shattered. "Excuse me," James said quietly, standing to retrieve something from the overhead compartment. Alexander instinctively pulled his legs in, making the space as narrow as possible, a physical manifestation of his desire to minimize their interaction. An elderly woman in 1B turned around, her eyes darting between Alexander and James, then lingering on Alexander's rigid posture and obvious tension. Her slight frown suggested disapproval, but Alexander couldn't tell if it was directed at him or his seatmate. He chose to interpret it as the former, adding another log to the fire of his indignation. As the flight progressed, Alexander found himself increasingly agitated by James's calm competence. Every professional interaction with the crew, Every quiet phone call that hinted at business dealings, every subtle indication that James was exactly where he belonged, it all scraped against Alexander's deeply ingrained beliefs like sandpaper on raw nerves. He thought about his own son, currently attending the same exclusive prep school he had, learning the same unspoken rules about social hierarchy. What would he tell him about this flight? How would he explain that the carefully constructed walls of privilege were becoming increasingly permeable? A notification chimed on James's laptop. An incoming video call request from what appeared to be a major tech company CEO. James declined it smoothly, making a note in his phone. Alexander caught himself wondering how James had managed to acquire such connections, his mind automatically assuming some form of affirmative action rather than merit. The businessman in 3C had been watching the dynamics unfold with increasing interest. His eyes met Alexander's several times, each glance an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared discomfort with the changing face of privilege. But there was something else in his expression, too. A hint of embarrassment, perhaps even shame, at their mutual prejudice. As they passed the halfway point of their journey, Alexander's discomfort had evolved into a nearly physical sensation. His starched collar felt too tight, his seat too confined. The proximity to James, to the challenge he represented to Alexander's worldview, was becoming unbearable. Sophie passed by again, her professional demeanor unchanged, but her eyes slightly narrowed as she observed Alexander's obvious distress. She had seen this drama play out before in other flights and other cabins. The subtle dance of privilege confronting change, of entitlement meeting equality. Alexander pulled out his phone, scrolling through his social media feed, filled with faces that looked like his, voices that echoed his thoughts, a carefully curated bubble of homogeneity. But even here, reality was beginning to intrude. Posts about diversity initiatives, articles about changing demographics in corporate leadership, hashtags promoting equality. All of it seemed to mock his desire for things to remain as they were. James closed his laptop and reclined his seat slightly, preparing to rest. The simple action seemed to Alexander like a declaration of belonging, a quiet assertion of equal right to occupy this space. And in that moment, as the plane cruised high above the patchwork landscape of America, Alexander felt his carefully constructed world of privilege beginning to crumble. Little did he know his discomfort was about to transform into something far more public, as the next phase of this journey would force him to confront his prejudices in ways he never expected. 3 hours into the flight, Alexander Thompson could no longer contain his simmering discomfort. He watched as James Carter received his third business call, speaking quietly but confidently about market projections and investment strategies. It was the final straw. Pressing the call button, Alexander waited for Sophie Chen to appear, rehearsing the carefully coded language he'd perfected over decades of veiling prejudice and respectability. Sophie approached with her characteristic professional smile. "How may I help you, Mr. Thompson?" Alexander glanced meaningfully at James, then lowered his voice. "Miss Chen, might I have a word with you in private?" Sophie's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes, recognition of a scene she'd witnessed too many times before. "Of course, sir. Please follow me." Near the galley, Alexander straightened his tie, assuming the authoritative pose that typically commanded deference in his corporate world. "I need to discuss the profile of the first-class cabin," he began, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to having his preferences accommodated. "Could you elaborate, Mr. Thompson?" Sophie's tone was measured, her dark eyes steady. "Well," he continued, leaning closer, "I believe certain standards should be maintained in first class. My seatmate seems less suited to this environment. Perhaps there's been some mistake in the booking?" Sophie Chen had spent 12 years as a flight attendant, dealing with every shade of prejudice imaginable. As an Asian American woman, she'd faced her own battles with discrimination. Her response was practiced but pointed. "Mr. Thompson, are you suggesting there's an issue with Mr. Carter's presence in first class because of his race?" The directness of her question caught Alexander off guard. His carefully constructed facade cracked slightly. That's not. I'm simply concerned about maintaining the appropriate atmosphere. He's been on business calls, disturbing other passengers. Mr. Carter has been conducting himself perfectly professionally, Sophie interrupted, her voice firm but quiet. In fact, he's been one of our most courteous passengers. If you're uncomfortable, I'd be happy to find you a seat in economy class. Alexander's face flushed red. Economy? I paid for first class. I'm a platinum member. Yes, and so did Mr. Carter, Sophie replied. Our airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. If you're uncomfortable sitting next to another passenger due to their race, we can accommodate you elsewhere on the aircraft. Back in the cabin, James remained focused on his work, his posture relaxed but dignified. He could hear fragments of the conversation, as could nearby passengers who were now watching with undisguised interest. Yet he maintained his composure, his fingers steady on the keyboard, his expression serene. This is outrageous, Alexander sputtered. I never mention race. I'm talking about standards, about the quality of service we expect in first class. Mr. Thompson, Sophie's voice took on an edge of steel. Let me be very clear. Your coded language about standards and profiles is transparent. Mr. Carter is a valued customer who has every right to be here. Your options are to return to your seat and complete the flight respectfully, or accept a seat in economy. Those are your only choices. The hushed conversation had drawn the attention of other crew members. A male flight attendant positioned himself nearby, a subtle show of support for Sophie. Through the curtain, several economy passengers had noticed the confrontation, phones discreetly emerging to record the scene. Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. His usual tactics, the careful language, the assumption of authority, the expectation of deference, were crumbling. Sophie's unwavering stance and direct confrontation of his bias had stripped away his protective veneer of respectability. Back at his seat, James continued working, his dignified silence more powerful than any words could have been. He hadn't flinched, hadn't engaged, hadn't given Alexander the satisfaction of a reaction. His presence alone was a rebellion against decades of exclusion and prejudice. I'll return to my seat, Alexander finally managed, his voice hollow. The walk back felt endless, every eye in first class following his retreat. As he settled into his seat, the silence between him and James seemed to echo with unspoken accusations. Sophie's voice carried clearly as she made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to remind everyone that our airline celebrates diversity and maintains strict policies against discrimination of any kind. All our passengers deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. The message was clear. This wasn't just about one passenger's comfort anymore. It was about confronting the casual racism that often hid behind premium cabin curtains and membership status. James finally looked up from his laptop, meeting Sophie's eyes with a quiet nod of appreciation. She returned it with a warm smile, then turned to Alexander with professional detachment. Will you be requiring anything else, Mr. Thompson? Alexander shook his head, suddenly finding the view out the window intensely interesting. But his reflection in the plexiglass showed him something he couldn't escape, the image of a man whose privilege had just been publicly challenged and found wanting. The incident wasn't over, though. As phones disappeared into pockets and passengers returned to their activities, the digital record of Alexander's prejudice was already beginning its journey through the internet, about to transform a private confrontation into a very public reckoning. The cabin intercom crackled to life, interrupting the tense atmosphere that had settled over first class. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Elena Martinez speaking. The voice was firm, authoritative, and carried a note of controlled anger that immediately commanded attention. It has come to my attention that we've had an incident involving discriminatory behavior in our first-class cabin. Let me be absolutely clear. On this aircraft, as in all our operations, we have zero tolerance for racism or discrimination of any kind. Alexander Thompson sank lower in his seat, his face burning as Captain Martinez continued. The tables had turned dramatically. The power dynamics he'd taken for granted his entire life were shifting beneath his feet. Every passenger who boards this aircraft has earned their right to be here, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or appearance. This isn't just company policy, it's basic human dignity. If anyone feels uncomfortable with these values, I remind you that we're happy to book you on another airline for your future travel needs." A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. A middle-aged black woman in row 3 nodded emphatically, making deliberate eye contact with Alexander. An Asian executive across the aisle, who had earlier seemed sympathetic to Alexander's discomfort, now straightened his shoulders and turned pointedly away. Furthermore, Captain Martinez's voice continued, "I want to apologize to any passengers who have been made to feel unwelcome. This is not the experience we want for our customers, and we will take appropriate action to address such behavior." James Carter remained focused on his laptop, but a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. He hadn't spoken a word during the entire incident, yet his dignified silence spoke volumes. Several passengers, including a young white couple who had previously shared knowing looks with Alexander, now directed warm smiles toward James. Sophie Chen moved through the cabin with renewed purpose, her head held high. She stopped at James's seat. "Mr. Carter, is there anything you need?" "I'm fine, thank you, Sophie," James replied quietly. "You've handled everything perfectly." The simple exchange carried weight. Other crew members positioned themselves strategically throughout the cabin, their presence a clear statement of solidarity. The male flight attendant who had backed up Sophie earlier now stood at the front of the cabin, his posture protective rather than servile. Alexander watched as his carefully constructed world of privilege continued to crumble. A young Indian woman in business attire caught his eye, her gaze unflinching and challenging. She raised her phone slightly. He could see she was posting something on social media. His stomach churned as he realized this incident wouldn't stay contained within the aircraft. "I've been flying first class for 20 years. A distinguished-looking white man in his 60s spoke up from across the aisle, his voice carrying deliberately. "And I've seen enough of this nonsense. Times are changing, thank God. We should all be ashamed it took this long." The comment struck Alexander like a physical blow. Even those he would have considered his natural allies were turning against him. The comfortable bubble of privilege that had protected him for so long was bursting in spectacular fashion. A flight attendant distributed feedback forms to several passengers who had witnessed the incident. Alexander could see them writing detailed accounts, their pens moving with purpose. The documentation of his behavior was becoming official, institutional. "Sir," Sophie approached Alexander with professional detachment. "Captain Martinez would like to remind you that any further discriminatory behavior will result in immediate action upon landing. Do you understand?" Alexander managed a weak nod, hyper-aware of the phone still recording intermittently around the cabin. The power dynamic had shifted completely. He was no longer the entitled executive whose comfort was paramount, but the exposed bigot whose behavior warranted monitoring. James closed his laptop and reclined his seat slightly, his body language relaxed and confident. He owned his space unapologetically, while Alexander seemed to shrink in his. Other passengers now directed their attention to James with respect and sympathy, while Alexander received only cold shoulders or disapproving glances. The remainder of the flight stretched ahead, and Alexander realized with growing dread that this was only the beginning. Captain Martinez's intervention had transformed a personal confrontation into a public stance against racism, and the ripples were spreading beyond the confines of the aircraft. As the plane continued its journey westward, the first-class cabin had become a microcosm of a changing society, one where privilege was no longer a shield for prejudice, and where silence in the face of discrimination was no longer an option. The videos were already spreading across social media platforms, and Alexander Thompson's name was about to become synonymous with the very kind of entitled racism that corporate America was increasingly eager to distance itself from. The first video hit Twitter while Flight AA-1284 was still 3 hours from San Francisco. Posted by a traveling tech with the caption, "Racism in First Class. Watch this entitled exec melt down over successful black passenger. #FlyingWhileBlack." The clip quickly gained traction. Within minutes, it was being shared across multiple platforms. Alexander Thompson noticed the increasing glow of phone screens throughout the cabin, accompanied by the soft taps of typing and occasional sharp intakes of breath as passengers read incoming notifications. He didn't yet realize that his carefully curated professional reputation was unraveling at 35,000 feet. A second angle appeared on Instagram, this one capturing his confrontation with Sophie Chun in crisp detail. The poster, a popular travel influencer in row 3, added context. Witness the moment when casual racism meets professional shutdown. Watch how this flight attendant handles discrimination with pure class. At Sophie Fly High, you're my hero. Hashtag Stop Racism. Hashtag Aviation Equality. The videos began their viral journey through the digital ecosystem. Twitter users quickly identified Alexander Thompson, his LinkedIn profile becoming a target for public scrutiny. His role as executive vice president at Sterling Financial Services was screenshot and shared, accompanied by calls for corporate accountability. Hey, at Sterling Financial, is this the kind of leadership you promote? Your EVP seems to have issues with black passengers in first class. Care to comment? Hashtag corporate racism. James Carter's identity emerged organically through the digital detective work of social media users. Wait, that's James Carter, CEO of Innovatech Solutions. The guy who just closed a $300 million deal with Google? No wonder that racist exec is squirming. Hashtag Karma is real. Articles began appearing on tech news websites. Silicon Valley leader faces racial discrimination on flight. TechCrunch. Innovatech CEO's dignified response to first-class racism goes viral. The Verge. When privilege meets progress. The flight that exposed corporate America's racial bias. Forbes. LinkedIn was ablaze with professional commentary. As a DI consultant, this incident perfectly illustrates why we need systematic change in corporate culture. The casual entitlement, the coded language, the assumption of belonging. This is what BIPOC professionals face daily. Hashtag corporate accountability, DR. Sarah Martinez, Chief Diversity Officer. Proud to say Innovatech has been a partner in our tech diversity initiative. James Carter isn't just a brilliant entrepreneur. He's a role model for breaking barriers. Shame on those who still can't see past skin color. Déconclusion coalition. Alexander's phone buzzed with an urgent email from Sterling Financial's PR department. Be advised that the incident is trending. Crisis management team assembling. Expect media inquiries upon landing. Do not make any public statements. In the cabin, James Carter received a text from his communications director. Videos going viral. You're trending for all the right reasons. Major tech CEOs expressing support. Want to release a statement? James replied simply, not yet. Let's see how this plays out. The airline's social media team was already in action, releasing a statement. We stand firmly against discrimination in all forms. The incident on AA 1284 is being thoroughly investigated. Our commitment to inclusive travel is unwavering. Hashtag everyone belongs. Corporate responses began cascading across platforms. Major airlines announced reviews of their first-class policies. Tech companies reaffirmed their commitment to diversity. Business leaders shared their own experiences with travel discrimination. A thread about James Carter's achievements went viral. For those wondering who the first-class passenger is, MIT graduate top of his class, founded Innovatech at 27, raised $500 million in venture capital, created 1,000-plus tech jobs, major philanthropists supporting STEM education in underserved communities, but sure, question his right to be in first class. Faced with rolling eyes, hashtag Black Excellence. Alexander's world continued to shrink as the digital storm grew. His phone showed notifications from professional contacts quietly disconnecting on LinkedIn. Email alerts indicated canceled meetings. The carefully constructed network of privilege was disintegrating in real time. Meanwhile, James received a direct message from a prominent black business leader. Standing with you, brother. Your composure speaks volumes. This moment is bigger than one flight. You're showing them what real class looks like. Raised fist, medium dark skin tone. The incident was becoming a case study in real time about privilege, prejudice, and power in modern America. Corporate training departments were already bookmarking the videos for future diversity sessions. DI consultants were drafting proposals based on the incident. As the flight entered its final hours, the digital verdict was clear. Alexander Thompson had become the face of outdated privilege, while James Carter emerged as a symbol of excellence overcoming prejudice. The power dynamics hadn't just shifted in the cabin. They had been transformed in the court of public opinion. The story was no longer contained to a first-class cabin. It had become a viral moment forcing corporate America to confront its ongoing struggle with racial bias. And somewhere over Nevada, as Alexander Thompson watched his reputation dissolve through his phone screen, the true weight of his actions began to sink in. As Flight AA-1284 began its gradual descent toward San Francisco, Alexander Thompson stared at his reflection in the darkened window. The face looking back at him was no longer that of a confident executive, but of a man forced to confront the ugliness of his own prejudices in the harsh light of public scrutiny. His phone had become almost too heavy to hold, each notification a fresh reminder of his spectacular fall from grace. A message from his daughter, a junior at Berkeley, cut deeper than any corporate rebuke. "Dad, how could you? My friends are sharing these videos. I'm ashamed. We need to talk about this." Next to him, James Carter continued to work with unshakable composure. Alexander found himself studying the man he had so quickly judged, seeing for the first time what he had willfully ignored before. The quiet confidence of someone who had earned every inch of his success, the dignity of a professional who had likely faced countless moments like this one. "Mr. Thompson," James spoke suddenly, his voice low and measured, breaking his hours-long silence. "I've faced men like you my entire career. The difference now is that the world is watching, and they're finally seeing what we've always known." The simple statement landed like a punch to Alexander's gut. In James's calm demeanor, he saw decades of similar confrontations, of having to maintain composure while facing prejudice. How many first-class cabins? How many boardrooms? How many country clubs? Alexander's mind wandered to his own history of casual discrimination. The resumes he'd dismissed because the names sounded too ethnic. The promotions he'd influenced away from qualified candidates of color. The social circles he'd carefully curated to maintain his comfortable bubble of privilege. Each memory now felt like a weight around his neck. "I've spent my entire life," Alexander found himself saying, more to himself than to James, "believing I earned everything I have." "Perhaps you did," James replied, closing his laptop. "But you also spent your life ensuring others couldn't earn the same, even when they were more qualified. That's the difference between earning success and hoarding privilege." The truth of those words resonated through Alexander's consciousness. He thought about the countless times he'd used coded language about cultural fit and maintaining standards. How many James Carters had he blocked from opportunities, all while convincing himself it wasn't about race? His phone buzzed again, an email from the board of directors at Sterling Financial. Subject line: "Emergency meeting scheduled." The professional consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. But somehow, the corporate fallout felt secondary to the moral reckoning he was experiencing. "Your behavior today," James continued, his voice still calm but firm, "isn't just about me. It's about every person of color who's had to work twice as hard to be considered half as worthy. The only difference is that today, you got caught." Alexander watched as a flight attendant approached James with particular respect, offering him priority, deplaning information. The same staff who had once catered to Alexander's every whim now treated him with bare minimum professional courtesy. The shift in social capital was palpable. Looking around the cabin, Alexander saw his own shame reflected in the faces of passengers who had initially shared his discomfort with James's presence. They too were grappling with their complicity in casual racism, their own biases exposed by the harsh light of public scrutiny. "I don't expect your apology," James said, gathering his belongings as the plane began its final approach. "What I expect is for this moment to follow you, to make you think twice before assuming your privilege gives you the right to question someone else's presence in any space." The weight of being on the wrong side of history pressed down on Alexander. He thought about his grandchildren, imagining them someday finding these videos, seeing their grandfather as a cautionary tale in lessons about racism and privilege. The legacy he had worked so hard to build was crumbling, replaced by a very different kind of lasting impact. As the San Francisco skyline appeared through the window, Alexander Thompson realized he had become more than just a viral moment. He had become a symbol of the dying gasps of entitled racism in corporate America. His discomfort with a black man in first class would now serve as a teaching moment in diversity trainings, a case study in how quickly privilege can be exposed and condemned in the digital age. The fastened seatbelt sign illuminated, and Alexander felt the plane descending, much like his carefully constructed world of privilege. There would be no going back to the comfortable assumptions and unchallenged biases of yesterday. The mirror had been held up, and the reflection would haunt him long after this flight ended. As Flight AA-1284 taxied to its gate at San Francisco International Airport, the weight of inevitability hung in the air. Passengers remained seated, an unusual stillness permeating the cabin. Everyone sensed that this moment demanded witness. James Carter gathered his belongings with deliberate calm, then turned to face Alexander Thompson. The entire first-class cabin fell silent, phones discreetly raised to capture what would become the final act of this airborne drama. "Mr. Thompson," James began, his voice carrying the weight of generations, "I want you to understand something. When you looked at me today, you saw what centuries of prejudice taught you to see. But what you failed to see was a human being who, like you, earned his place in this world." Alexander's throat tightened as James continued, each word precise and measured. "Your discomfort with my presence reveals more about you than it ever could about me. Every sideways glance, every subtle shift away, every attempted complaint, these weren't about maintaining standards. They were about maintaining a system that makes you comfortable at the expense of others' dignity." Around them, passengers nodded in silent agreement. The young white couple who had initially shared Alexander's prejudices now looked down in shame. The Asian executive across the aisle was filming openly, his face set in grim determination to document this moment. "Your generation of executives likes to talk about diversity and inclusion in corporate boardrooms," James continued. "But when confronted with it in first class, in country clubs, in executive lounges, suddenly those principles become inconvenient. Today, you became the inconvenient truth about corporate America's persistent racism." Alexander's phone buzzed continuously, messages from colleagues, friends, family. His social media notifications had exploded. A text from his son. "Dad, you're trending for all the wrong reasons." Mom's crying. "The truly sad part," James said, standing now, his presence commanding the space, "is that while you spent this flight questioning my right to be here, you never once considered questioning your own prejudices. That's the real first-class problem. The entitled assumption that your comfort matters more than others' rights." Sophie Chen appeared at James's side, a silent show of support. Other crew members positioned themselves throughout the cabin, their stance making it clear whose side they were on. To everyone who spoke up today, James addressed the cabin at large. "Thank you. Silence in the face of discrimination makes us complicit. Your voices matter. Your actions matter. Change happens when good people refuse to let moments like this slide." The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Several passengers stood, creating a moment that would be shared millions of times across social media platforms. Alexander remained seated, physically present but spiritually diminished. "As for you, Mr. Thompson," James turned back to him one final time, "I hope this experience follows you. Not to punish you, but to change you. Every time you enter a premium space and see a person of color, remember this flight. Remember how your prejudices were exposed. Remember how history caught up with you at 35,000 feet." As passengers began to deplane, Alexander could hear snippets of conversations. "Did you see the LinkedIn responses? Sterling Financial stock is already responding. My DI department is going to use this as a case study." James Carter walked off the plane first, his dignity intact, his impact lasting. Alexander remained seated, watching as his fellow passengers either avoided his gaze or shot him looks of disapproval. The professional consequences were already unfolding. His phone showed emails about administrative leave and pending investigation. But beyond the professional fallout, something fundamental had shifted in Alexander Thompson's world. The comfortable lies he'd told himself about his own prejudices lay shattered. The carefully constructed justifications for his bias had crumbled in the face of James Carter's powerful truth. As he finally stood to leave, Sophie Chin's voice carried from behind him. "Mr. Thompson, remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to be judged, to be found wanting, to have your right to occupy a space questioned. That's what real learning feels like." He stepped off the plane into a world that had changed during the 6-hour flight. His name was trending. His actions were being dissected. His privilege was being examined under the harsh light of public scrutiny. But more importantly, his own understanding of himself, of his biases, his prejudices, his place in the world had been fundamentally altered. The truth had confronted him at cruising altitude, and there was no returning to the comfortable altitude of ignorance. 3 months after Flight AA-1284, the ripples of that fateful journey continued to spread through corporate America and beyond. Alexander Thompson sat in his home office, staring at the email that would define the next chapter of his life. Sterling Financial's board had accepted his resignation, coupling it with a public commitment to overhaul their diversity and inclusion practices. His severance package came with a requirement: mandatory participation in extensive diversity training and speaking engagements about his experience. On his desk lay an unopened invitation from James Carter. Innovatech Solutions was hosting a conference on diversity in tech leadership, and James wanted Alexander to participate in a panel titled "Confronting Privilege: Personal Stories of Change." The thought made his stomach churn, but he knew he would accept. It was part of his penance, his education, his transformation. The airline incident had become a case study in corporate training programs across the country. #FirstClass Racism had sparked a broader conversation about exclusive spaces and who gets to occupy them. Major airlines had revised their training protocols, incorporating lessons from Sophie Chin's handling of the situation. James Carter's professional stature had risen even higher. His composed response to discrimination had earned him widespread admiration. And in Novatech, his value had soared as companies sought to partner with a leader who embodied grace under pressure. He launched a foundation focused on supporting minority entrepreneurs in tech, with several major corporations scrambling to contribute. Sophie Chin had been promoted to lead flight attendant trainer, specifically developing programs on handling discrimination in premium cabins. Her calm professionalism had set a new standard for airline responses to racial incidents. The viral videos had become teaching tools, analyzed in business schools and corporate seminars. Alexander sometimes caught glimpses of himself on screens during diversity workshops, his face frozen in that moment of exposed prejudice serving as a warning to others. His relationship with his children had changed profoundly. His daughter, initially ashamed, had forced difficult conversations about race and privilege at family dinners. His son, working in tech, reported that the incident had sparked vital discussions in his own workplace about unconscious bias. One evening, as Alexander prepared for his first public speaking engagement about the incident, he received an unexpected email from a Black executive. "Mr. Thompson, I've been following your journey since that flight. While your initial actions were reprehensible, your willingness to acknowledge your mistakes and work toward change has not gone unnoticed. Many would have hidden away or denied everything. You chose to face the truth. That matters." Marcus Williams, CEO, Williams Global Technologies. The message reminded Alexander of his last conversation with James Carter, just before accepting the speaking engagement. "Your story is important," James had said, "not because you were wrong, but because you're learning to be right. Change doesn't happen when the perfect people lead the way. It happens when the flawed ones admit their mistakes and do the work to be better." As Alexander Thompson prepared to share his story of transformation, he realized that his legacy would no longer be defined by that moment of exposed prejudice, but by what he chose to do with the understanding he gained from it. The first-class cabin had become a classroom, teaching lessons about privilege, power, and the possibility of change. And somewhere over America, another flight was taking off, carrying with it the hope that the next confrontation with prejudice would find more allies ready to stand up, more people prepared to acknowledge their biases, and fewer comfortable spaces for racism to hide.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.